It was winter, 1851. The freezing air bit through the bricks of St. Margaret's School, but something darker was about to bite into the soul of anyone who dared to understand the truth. In the depths of its ancient stone walls, beneath where the laughter of young girls once echoed, something was being buried, something that would haunt anyone who knew of it for the rest of their lives. A teacher, Elizabeth Hartwell, stumbled upon it one cold, dreary day. Alone in the depths of the school's forgotten basement, she noticed a strange, cold draft and a flicker of movement behind a false wall. Intrigued, she pushed aside the heavy stone, revealing the secret space behind. And there, in the eerie silence, the truth revealed itself. A forgotten room, once meant to house the abandoned, but now the final resting place of something far more sinister. 20 orphaned girls, young souls torn from the safety of the world, their lives cut short by forces so dark that no one dared to speak their names. Each child lay in chains, not in the freedom of childhood innocence, but bound to a fate no one could escape. Beside each bed was something to remember them by, a cracked doll, a torn ribbon, a cross weathered by time. But it was the scrawl on the wall, the desperate, trembling words that froze Elizabeth's blood. We are still here. For decades, the truth of these girls' fate was buried, covered by a system so corrupt, so manipulative that even now their voices were silenced. But Elizabeth couldn't forget, and neither should you. What happened to these children, to their innocence and to their lives, goes deeper than you can possibly imagine. This is not just history, it is a hidden nightmare. A nightmare that forces us to question everything we've been taught about power, control, and the dark forces at work even now. The history of St. Margaret's isn't merely a story, it's a warning you must hear. Stay with me, and together we will unlock a secret that was never meant to see the light. But first, I need to ask you a question. Are you prepared to descend further into a world of shadows, a world where the truth isn't just unsettling, but dangerous? If so, subscribe now, hit that bell, and be ready for a journey that will change everything you thought you knew about history. For if you're here, you're not just a witness, you're about to become a part of this story. Let me set the stage for you. 1834. St. Margaret's, then known as St. Catherine's Academy, was established in the heart of Massachusetts, a place that promised sanctuary, education, and salvation for young orphan girls, a place where their lives, shattered by loss, would supposedly be repaired by the loving arms of the sisters who ran it. But as always with these institutions, there was more than meets the eye. The truth, buried under layers of deceit and manipulation, was far darker. The Academy, a towering structure, seemed majestic. Its Gothic architecture, the kind that inspired both awe and a quiet sense of unease, was meant to project respectability, piety, and charity. It was more than just a school. It was an institution with a carefully curated image that masked its true nature. Visitors saw what they were meant to see. Children working, learning, playing. But behind those tall walls and tight smiles, something more grotesque was taking root. The woman who led this so-called sanctuary, Mother Superior Victoria Whitman, seemed like the perfect figure of authority. Tall, severe, her black habit draped over her with an almost imposing dignity. Her voice, strong, measured, was enough to command any room. She told the world of her noble intentions, of her years spent training in Ireland, of the sacrifices she had made. But beneath that well-crafted exterior was a man who knew exactly what she was doing. She was the architect of a system that didn't just control, it crushed the will of those it claimed to help. And then there was Sister Agnes Murphy, stern, cold, and calculating. She was the businesswoman behind the operation, the one who kept everything in line, who made sure the girls were molded into the perfect products for whatever society demanded. Her role was one of enforcement, of ensuring that no one stepped out of line, and, for a long time, no one did. But the real tragedy, the girls, those who came to the academy with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the broken remnants of their past lives, they were never meant to leave. This wasn't a home, this was a factory for human souls, harvested, packaged, and sent to the highest bidder. The truth was hidden in plain sight, masked by good intentions and holy rhetoric. And for those who were curious enough to ask, there was always an answer, a lie wrapped in a carefully crafted smile. It didn't take long for the first whispers to surface. The girls, all orphaned, all seeking solace, would arrive from every corner of New England. Mary O'Brien, 13, had been torn from her home after a factory fire claimed both her parents. Sarah Thompson, 15, orphaned by consumption. Each girl, carrying the pain of loss, arrived in what they thought was a safe haven. And yet, what they would soon come to realize was that their pain was only beginning. The academy promised them an education, a future as teachers, wives, or governesses. It promised them a life of dignity, but it was all a smokescreen. The girls were nothing more than commodities, their futures bought and sold. They were trained in the arts of domestic servitude, all the while learning to suppress the natural spark of life that had once made them so full of hope. They were told they would be placed with respectable Christian families upon reaching the age of 18. They were promised a future filled with opportunity, love, and care, but there was no evidence of this. Not a single one of the girls placed with a family ever wrote back. Not a single one ever returned. The promises made were lies, deliberate, calculated lies. The outside world saw what it wanted to see. St. Catherine's was just another charity. But those who dared look deeper, who dared question the perfect facade, began to notice the pattern. The girls, so many of them, never left. And when a few did, they didn't return. They didn't write. They simply vanished. You see, it wasn't that they found happiness in their new homes. It wasn't that they were adopted into loving families. The truth was far darker. The girls were sent into the darkness of a world that no one wanted to acknowledge, a world hidden beneath the surface of New England's pious and respectable society. The first real crack in the carefully maintained facade came in 1843. Emma Prescott, a seamstress from Boston, knew something was wrong. She had known Mary O'Brien, one of the girls at St. Margaret's, before the fire took her parents. But when Emma spotted a familiar face in a brothel, her world began to unravel. The girl she saw wasn't just any girl, it was Mary. She had seen her die with her parents in the fire years ago, or so she thought. Now, here she was, in a brothel, far from the life of respectability promised to her by the academy. And she wasn't alone. Emma saw something in Mary's eyes, something that sent a chill deep into her bones. It was a look of resignation, a look that said she had been broken. But how? How could the girl she had known have ended up here, trapped in this hell? Emma couldn't ignore it. She wrote to St. Margaret's, asking after Mary, questioning the sisters' claims. The response was swift and chilling. Mary had been placed with a family, they said. She was thriving. But Emma knew it wasn't true. The handwriting, the tone, something was off. And so she pressed on, digging deeper, risking everything for the truth. But the academy wasn't going to let its secrets escape. The more Emma questioned, the more she was threatened. The response from Mother Superior Whitman was clear. Stop asking, stop digging, or face the consequences. The consequences were not subtle. Emma Prescott had walked too close to the truth, and now she would pay the price. Emma's story didn't end with threats. It was only the beginning of a deeper, darker descent into a world that would soon consume everything she had known. You see, the academy wasn't just a front for misplaced orphans. It was a part of something much bigger. A network of exploitation that spread across Massachusetts like a disease, festering in the shadows. In 1847, the truth began to slip through the cracks. The academy had become something more than a school. It was now an active part of a much larger, darker system. Young girls were not just placed in families. They were sold to wealthy men, to brothels, to those who could pay the price for a new companion. The girls were products, their innocence bartered for riches, power, and control. But this time, the system made a fatal mistake. Detective William Ashworth, an investigator from the Boston Police Department, had begun to connect the dots. The bodies of young women, marked with a peculiar symbol, SC, had been showing up in Boston Harbor. The markings were the same, a cross with the letters SC beneath it. The connection to St. Margaret's was clear, and Ashworth was closing in. Mother Superior Whitman had no idea who she was dealing with. Cornelius Blackwood, the man who had approached her for young girls, was not who he claimed to be. He wasn't a wealthy merchant at all. He was Ashworth, and he had been investigating the trafficking of young girls for months. The game was up, and the truth was about to be exposed. By the fall of 1847, the pressure was mounting on St. Margaret's, what had once been a carefully controlled operation, hidden beneath layers of religious devotion and promises of charity, was now unraveling. And the unraveling began with one key mistake. When Detective Ashworth, disguised as the wealthy Cornelius Blackwood, approached Mother Superior Whitman with his vile request, he had crossed a line that the Academy could no longer ignore. Whitman had been careful, too careful in her dealings. She knew that the girls under her control were not just orphans. They were commodities, precious little beings to be traded in the underworld of powerful men. But she also knew that no one could find out. No one could see how far her web had stretched, how far her manipulation reached. She had a reputation to uphold, and that reputation could only be maintained as long as no one questioned the system. But Ashworth's disguise, his patience, his calculated approach were too much. He had played the role of a wealthy merchant seeking a companion for his wife, offering 5 times the normal fee for a young girl, and Whitman took the bait. The desperation to fuel her operation, the hunger for the obscene wealth it promised, led her to overlook every sign of danger. It was too late when she realized the man she'd trusted wasn't a merchant at all, but an investigator digging into the most insidious parts of St. Margaret's hidden business. The cold, deliberate hand of the law had started to close in on her, and she had nowhere to run. But for all her intelligence and cunning, Whitman was not a fool. She had spent years creating a perfect facade, and if she was going to go down, she wasn't going to do it quietly. Sister Agnes Murphy, the Academy's enforcer, would do what was necessary to protect the Academy, but even she understood that they were no longer dealing with mere whispers. They were now dealing with a full-scale investigation that could expose everything. What had been an underground network, built with careful calculation, was now under the scrutiny of the law, and the girls who had long been sold into servitude were no longer just victims. They were witnesses, testimonies to a crime that had spanned years. But there was one thing Whitman knew that Ashworth didn't. She had powerful allies whose influence stretched from the upper echelons of New England society to the corridors of power in Boston. It wasn't just a handful of men involved in this network. It was a system, one that had been operating for decades. If the walls began to crumble, if the truth became known, it wouldn't just be the Academy that fell. It would bring down powerful families, political figures, and respected businessmen. Whitman had survived on her ability to manipulate, to control, to bend the truth to her will. Now she would have to use every tool at her disposal to protect the empire she had built on the backs of those poor, innocent girls. But the question remained, how far was she willing to go to protect herself? Ashworth was not naive. He knew he was up against something far bigger than just a corrupt orphanage. St. Margaret's was not simply the epicenter of this exploitation. It was a cog in a machine that reached into the darkest corners of New England, a machine that fed on human misery. And while the detective had played his role well, he now found himself caught between 2 forces he couldn't control: the law, which demanded justice, and the underworld, which would stop at nothing to protect its secrets. The moment Ashworth's investigation began to gain traction, the power players of this underground world began to react. Powerful families in Salem, Boston, and even New York, who had long turned a blind eye to the Academy's activities, now saw the danger. The fallout of a full-blown scandal would destroy reputations, wreck fortunes, and expose an elite network that had been carefully constructed for generations. But there was a more insidious force at play here: psychological control. Whitman wasn't just manipulating bodies, she was manipulating minds. Over the years she had perfected the art of domination through fear, intimidation, and religion. The girls under her care weren't just physically trapped, they were mentally and emotionally ensnared. They had been conditioned to believe that this was the only life they could have. The world outside of St. Margaret's was a terrifying unknown, and the Academy itself was the only place where they could be safe, even if it meant sacrificing their autonomy. It was this control, this psychological stranglehold, that kept the girls from speaking out. Even when Emma Prescott uncovered the truth, she wasn't just facing a wall of silence. She was facing the warped reality that Whitman and her sisters had crafted. It wasn't just a fear of retaliation. It was the knowledge that the girls had been so thoroughly brainwashed, so thoroughly broken, that they didn't know how to escape. They had been raised to be compliant, obedient, and most importantly, to accept their fate. But there was one girl who was different. Her name was Elizabeth Porter, one of the girls that Mother Superior had carefully selected to meet Cornelius Blackwood in private. Elizabeth was one of the most promising, her beauty a quiet, unsettling allure. At only 16, she had been taught everything from literature to domestic arts, but what she had been taught most of all was how to be silent, how to comply. But Elizabeth had a mind of her own, one that could no longer ignore the disturbing realization that her future had already been sold. When Ashworth entered the scene pretending to be a wealthy buyer, Elizabeth knew something was wrong. She wasn't naive. She had seen enough to know the true nature of her placement. It wasn't a family she was being sold to. It was a man's dark, twisted desires. But what could she do? She was just a girl in a system that had taught her to obey, to stay quiet, to submit. But Elizabeth's eyes burned with a cue. With rage, she wasn't going to be another pawn in Whitman's game. She began to make subtle moves to gather her courage. She would do what no one had done before. She would escape. And as Ashworth continued his investigation, he began to sense something shifting. A crack in the carefully maintained facade. Elizabeth Porter, whether she knew it or not, was now his most powerful ally in this dark war. She was the key to unlocking the truth and exposing the faces behind St. Margaret's terrible secret. But every hero has a price. Every truth comes with a cost, and Elizabeth Porter would soon learn that the price of revealing the truth was a far steeper one than she had ever imagined. Elizabeth's decision to defy the system that had controlled her for so long was not one she took lightly. The walls that had surrounded her for so many years, those walls that she had been taught to revere and never question, were crumbling before her eyes. The reality of what was happening at St. Margaret's Academy, of what had happened to the girls like her, was no longer something she could ignore. But the truth was more terrifying than she ever imagined. As she carefully navigated through the labyrinth of deceit that Mother Superior Whitman had so expertly created, Elizabeth began to understand the full scope of the Academy's reach. This was not just a small operation. This was an organized network that spanned far beyond Massachusetts, a system of trafficking, manipulation, and control that extended from the brothels of Boston to the mansions of New York City. The girls were not just property to be handed out to the highest bidder. They were a currency, an investment in a system of power that had been running for decades, and Elizabeth was just another cog in that machine, a product waiting to be sold. But unlike the others, she saw it now. She could see the manipulation in every smile, every gesture, every prayer that Mother Superior uttered. She knew the Academy wasn't a place of refuge. It was a prison. The moment Elizabeth's eyes opened, she realized how deep too corruption ran, how far-reaching the control was. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for all of them. She was fighting for the 20 orphan girls who had never left the Academy, the ones whose names had been forgotten, their bodies buried in the basement, chained to a life they never chose. She was fighting for every soul that had been erased in the name of power and profit. But the question was, who could she trust? In a world where every ally could be an enemy, where even the whispers in the shadows had an agenda, Elizabeth had to tread carefully. She couldn't rely on anyone but herself, and Ashworth, the man who had come too close to the truth. If he was willing to go this far, maybe, just maybe, he could help her take the Academy down. But making that leap was no small task. Elizabeth had to ask herself a chilling question. Would Ashworth even believe her if she told him the truth? Would he risk his life, his career, to expose a network so deeply entrenched, so powerful, that the entire fabric of society might tear apart if the truth came to light? Detective Ashworth, meanwhile, was walking a razor-thin line. His investigation into St. Margaret's had revealed enough to connect the dots between the Academy and the shadowy network of exploitation. But what he had uncovered went beyond mere prostitution. It was a system of systematic destruction, a psychological war waged on young women to break their spirits and turn them into compliant objects. Every thread he pulled seemed to lead back to one place: Mother Superior Victoria Whitman. Her charm, her calculated manipulation, had turned a charitable institution into a factory of horrors, and every move Ashworth made only seemed to expose the breadth of her empire, an empire that thrived on power, wealth, and control. The deeper Ashworth dug, the more he realized that this was not just a case of human trafficking. It was a case of psychological enslavement. The girls were not just being sold to men for pleasure, they were being systematically broken. Their sense of self, their memories, their identities were stripped away, leaving behind only the shell of a person, an empty vessel for whatever the Academy and its wealthy clients wanted them to be. Elizabeth Porter was more than just a girl trying to escape. She was a survivor, a girl who had seen through the lies and learned the hard truth about the system that had held her captive. But Ashworth knew he had to act fast. Every moment they wasted brought Whitman and her sisters closer to realizing that someone was onto them. And if they did, if Whitman and her allies found out that Ashworth was closing in, the cost would be unimaginable. The danger wasn't just to Ashworth, but to every girl trapped inside the Academy, every girl who had been sold and forgotten, every girl who had dared to dream of a life outside the walls of St. Margaret's. As Ashworth's investigation grew more dangerous, he knew that there would be no turning back. The truth would either come to light or it would be buried forever. The question was, how many more girls would have to suffer before he could expose what was happening? How many more lives would be destroyed by a system so entrenched in power that it would stop at nothing to protect itself? As the walls began to close in, Whitman's control began to fray. The cracks in her perfect facade were growing wider, and she knew it was only a matter of time before everything she had worked so hard to build came crashing down. But Whitman was not a woman who would simply step aside. She had fought for control over these girls for too long, and she wasn't about to let a few curious investigators ruin everything. The Academy's influence reached deep into the local community, and Whitman wasn't shy about using her connections to protect her empire. She had the support of powerful families who, like her, understood that the status quo must be maintained at all costs. In the eyes of these powerful men and women, the Academy was nothing more than a necessary institution, a tool to keep the lower classes in check and the elite in control. The tragedy, however, was that no one knew the full extent of the suffering that lay behind those walls. No one understood the horror that had been inflicted on the girls who entered St. Margaret's, their futures sold for a price. The families who believed their daughters were safe, placed in respectable Christian homes, would never have suspected the truth. They didn't see the desperate cries for help, the hollow eyes of the girls who had been forced into submission, the souls slowly dying behind the masks of obedience. But the system was unraveling, and Whitman knew she couldn't control everything. Every day, the danger of exposure loomed larger. The Academy had long since stopped being a sanctuary. It had become a battlefield, and Whitman would fight with everything she had to preserve it. But no one could fight against the truth forever. And the truth was coming. The truth was more terrifying than anyone could have predicted. As Ashworth and Elizabeth grew closer to unraveling the web of lies, they realized that the very foundation of society itself was at stake. The Academy, with its powerful patrons and influential protectors, was just one part of a much larger, much darker system, a system that had been operating in the shadows for generations. This wasn't just about a few corrupt women running an orphanage. This was about a network of power, wealth, and manipulation so vast and entrenched that it threatened to destroy everything in its path. The truth, when it was finally exposed, would not just shake the foundations of St. Margaret's, it would shake the very core of everything society held dear. And Elizabeth knew, deep down, that there was no turning back. The price of uncovering the truth would be high, but the cost of silence would be even higher. For every girl who had been lost, for every soul who had been sacrificed in the name of power, the truth had to come to light. But would Ashworth and Elizabeth be able to expose it before they became the next victims of a system that was designed to silence them forever? The final step in their plan was the most dangerous. Elizabeth and Ashworth knew that exposing the truth would not just end with Mother Superior Whitman's downfall. The stakes had risen far higher than either had anticipated. If they were to succeed, they would need proof, hard evidence that could not be ignored, evidence that could shatter the entire network. But getting that evidence meant entering the very heart of St. Margaret's, a place where danger lurked around every corner, where every person within its walls could either be a potential ally or an enemy. It was no longer just about the academy, it was about surviving long enough to tell the world what had really happened to those orphan girls. Elizabeth knew that she couldn't simply walk out of St. Margaret's, as she had so often dreamed of doing. She had to bide her time, gather the trust of the other girls, and wait for the right moment. The thought of her sisters, those trapped souls who had been in the academy far longer than she had, haunted her every night. They too had been brainwashed, molded into believing that this was the life they deserved. But Elizabeth understood now. They weren't just victims, they were survivors, even if they didn't yet know it. As Ashworth continued his investigation, he was met with increasing resistance. Whitman's allies were powerful, and they weren't going to let their empire fall without a fight. Ashworth's every move was now being watched. There were whispers, shadowy figures who seemed to know his every step, and even as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, he could feel the weight of their conspiracy closing in on him. The closer they came to the truth, the more dangerous it became. But there was no turning back. Elizabeth had made up her mind. She would not let these girls be forgotten. She would not let the academy continue to prey on the innocent, just as it had for decades. The truth had to be revealed, no matter the cost. On one fateful evening, the walls of St. Margaret's would finally begin to crumble. Elizabeth had spent weeks gaining the trust of the other girls, slowly awakening in them the realization that they too had been lied to, manipulated, and trapped. It wasn't easy. The fear of retribution was heavy on their hearts. But Elizabeth's strength became their strength, and one by one, the other girls began to speak out, whispering in the dark corners of the academy, their voices tentative but growing stronger with each passing day. But even as the girls began to talk, the reality of their situation sank in. They were not just fighting for their own freedom. They were fighting to expose a system so vast, so deeply entrenched in power and corruption, that no one could afford to let the truth be revealed. The price of silence was something they could no longer afford. And so, with one final act of defiance, Elizabeth made her move. She and the girls would do what no one else had dared. They would steal the evidence, the documents, the letters, the contracts that proved the academy's involvement in the trafficking ring. The plan was dangerous, nearly impossible. Every moment spent within St. Margaret's was a risk, every step a potential death sentence. But if they didn't act, they would be lost forever, consumed by the system they had been born into. As Elizabeth and Ashworth coordinated their movements, the tension grew unbearable. They were running out of time. The academy was about to enter lockdown. Whitman had grown suspicious. And soon, the trap would be set. But Elizabeth knew what had to be done. She had to break free, and she had to take the truth with her. The night was their only ally. As the academy fell into its usual rhythms, night prayers, the final rounds of the sisters checking the dormitories, Elizabeth and the other girls made their way to the hidden room in the basement, the one they had all heard, whispered about, but never truly seen. The room where the orphan girls who were never placed were locked away, forgotten by the world. The room that was now the final resting place for the lost, the tortured, and the silenced. It was in this room that they would find the proof that would bring the academy to its knees. The letters, the ledgers, the names of powerful men, men who had paid for their companions, men who had used their wealth and influence to cover up the academy's true business. This was the evidence they needed. But the journey to that room was fraught with danger. As they made their way through the dark, winding halls, every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind felt like a threat. They knew that if they were caught, there would be no mercy. The system would crush them, just as it had crushed so many before. It was Elizabeth who led the way, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been a prisoner in this place for so long. But tonight, she was no longer just a victim. She was a fighter, and she was ready to tear down the walls that had held her for so long. When they finally reached the hidden room, the sight that greeted them was nothing short of horrifying. The walls were lined with files, letters, and contracts, all carefully stored away, each one a piece of the Academy's dark legacy. Elizabeth grabbed the documents with trembling hands, knowing that this was the moment that would change everything. But as they turned to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. Someone was coming. The moment they had feared had arrived. Ashworth's heart raced as he heard the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps. Elizabeth froze, the documents clutched tightly to her chest. They had only moments before they were caught. There was no time to hesitate. They had to act, and they had to act fast. But the fear that this was the moment they would all pay the price, threatened to overwhelm them. "Move," Elizabeth whispered to the girls, her voice steady but fierce. "Now." As they hurried through the shadows, every breath felt like it might be their last. Elizabeth's mind raced. If they were caught, all would be lost. They had no backup plan, no way to escape the consequences of being discovered. But as the footsteps grew louder, she pushed those thoughts aside. The truth was worth the risk. Just as the door to the hallway creaked open, Elizabeth and the others slipped through a side passage, their hearts pounding in their chests. For a moment it seemed as if they had made it out unscathed, but then a figure appeared in the doorway, Sister Agnes Murphy, the disciplinarian who had overseen the Academy's darkest operations. Her cold eyes locked onto Elizabeth's, and for a split second, time seemed to stand still. But then, with a fierce determination, Elizabeth pushed past her, the evidence in her hands. And she didn't look back. What followed was a frenzy. An escape through the very heart of the Academy, through corridors that had once seemed like home, but now felt like a prison. The walls of St. Margaret's, which had held them in silence for so long, were now collapsing around them. Ashworth, already waiting on the outside, knew the moment they had to act. He had seen the fear in Elizabeth's eyes when she handed him the documents, but he also saw something else, resolve. This was no longer about uncovering a scandal. This was about exposing a system that had allowed abuse, manipulation, and control to flourish unchecked. The Academy wasn't it's just a place of fear. It was a fortress of corruption, and now Elizabeth and Ashworth held the key to bringing it down. The final battle had begun. As they emerged into the cool night air, the weight of the evidence in their hands was both a blessing and a curse. Elizabeth and Ashworth had made it out, but they knew they weren't safe yet. The Academy would stop at nothing to prevent the truth from coming to light. The powerful figures behind St. Margaret's, those who had financially invested in its dark operations, would do everything in their power to silence them. The sound of footsteps in the distance, faint but unmistakable, made Elizabeth's blood run cold. They weren't alone. Someone was already chasing them. "Keep moving," Ashworth whispered sharply, his hand tightening around her wrist. The urgency in his voice made Elizabeth's heart pound even faster. They had no time to waste. Every second felt like an eternity as they sprinted through the shadows, hoping that the night would conceal them long enough for the police to intervene. They couldn't outrun the truth. The evidence was too important. It had to be delivered to the authorities, those who could see the Academy for what it truly was. But how much time did they have? The Academy's influence was vast, and it wasn't just the law they had to fear. "Where are they?" A voice, familiar but filled with fury, rang out through the empty streets. Elizabeth's stomach dropped. It was Sister Agnes. She had been one of the first to realize that the girls had gone missing, and now she was hunting them down. Ashworth turned to Elizabeth, his expression set with determination. "We're getting this out, no matter the cost." Elizabeth nodded, her chest tightening with both fear and resolve. She was no longer just a victim. She was part of a rebellion, one that would expose everything that had been hidden for too long. It wasn't just about the Academy anymore. It was about breaking the cycle of control, manipulation, and fear that had defined her life for so long. She, too, would feel the energy of all the other girls, all those who had suffered in silence. This was their moment. But every step they took toward freedom also brought them closer to danger. The chase through the darkened streets of Salem was relentless. Sister Agnes's voice echoed through the narrow alleys, and Elizabeth could feel the hot breath of danger nipping at her heels. But Ashworth was a seasoned investigator. He knew how to vanish in plain sight. how to make himself disappear when the odds were stacked against him. He pulled Elizabeth into an abandoned building, the shadows swallowing them whole. Breathing heavily, Elizabeth's heart raced in her chest. Her entire life had been controlled, but tonight she was in control. She wasn't running from her past. She was confronting it, and she wasn't alone. Ashworth's calm presence reassured her, his focus steady and unwavering. "We need to get to the courthouse," Ashworth said, his voice low but intense. "It's our best chance. We'll hand the documents over to the authorities, and from there, it'll be out of our hands." But even as Ashworth spoke, Elizabeth knew there was no guarantee. The network they were up against was too deep, too entrenched. Even if they managed to get the evidence into the right hands, there were powerful people willing to do anything to protect their secrets. The academy wasn't just a place for orphans, it was a cesspool of manipulation and power, and the people who ran it would not go down easily. Elizabeth glanced at Ashworth, and for the first time, she saw the weight of the situation in his eyes. The fear of being caught, the fear of losing everything they had fought for. It was all too real. But there was one thing they both knew. There was no turning back. By the time they reached the courthouse, the weight of the evidence they carried was almost unbearable. They were close, so close, to shattering the illusion that had kept St. Margaret's Academy hidden for so long. But the threat of retaliation loomed larger than ever. The courthouse, a symbol of justice, stood before them like a fortress, but inside it, they both knew, would be a fight for more than just the truth. It was a fight for their lives. Ashworth led Elizabeth through the side entrance, keeping their movement swift and unnoticed. They had already been spotted once, and it was only a matter of time before someone realized what they had. The clock was ticking. Inside, the tension was palpable. They weren't just fighting for the girls trapped in St. Margaret's. They were fighting to expose the dark heart of a system that had used its power to manipulate, exploit, and destroy. Every word they spoke, every document they handed over, would change everything. But as they approached the court clerk's office, a figure stepped into their path, someone they hadn't anticipated. "Sister Agnes," Elizabeth muttered under her breath. She had found them. Sister Agnes's eyes blazed with fury. "You thought you could escape, didn't you?" Her voice was sharp, cutting through the tense air between them. She stepped closer, blocking the door to the clerk's office. Ashworth's hand instinctively moved to the small revolver he carried, but Elizabeth's gaze stopped him. "No, we won't fight her." Sister Agnes's lip curled in a sinister smile. "You think you've won? Do you think exposing us will change anything? The academy isn't just about orphans, it's about control. And you will learn what happens when you defy that control." Elizabeth's heart thudded in her chest. She knew the danger. She knew how far Sister Agnes would go to protect the academy, but she also knew one undeniable truth. They were not alone. The girls they had fought for, their voices were now in the air, a murmur rising across the city. Elizabeth stood tall, her shoulders squared. "We've already won. The truth is already out." Sister Agnes took a step back, her face contorting with rage. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Elizabeth could hear the unmistakable tread of more people, powerful figures who had come to protect the academy. But as Elizabeth and Ashworth stood their ground, they knew the truth would never be hidden again. The courtroom was chaos. Sister Agnes and her allies, emboldened by years of power, had rallied to try and suppress the evidence, to bury the truth one last time. But the evidence they carried, those damning documents, spoke for themselves. No amount of manipulation, no amount of control, could deny the truth that had been carefully hidden for decades. As the court clerk reviewed the documents, the room fell silent. The faces of those who had once been untouchable now betrayed their fear. For the first time they realized they were no longer in control. The Academy's dark empire was crumbling piece by piece, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. But it wasn't just the Academy that was falling. It was the very system that had allowed it to thrive. The web of power and corruption, the manipulation of vulnerable children, the broken lives. All of it was exposed, laid bare for the world to see. The trial was long, the legal battles brutal, but in the end, the truth triumphed. St. Margaret's Academy was shut down, its leaders arrested, and its dark secrets finally brought to light. The powerful network of corruption that had sustained it for so many years was dismantled, piece by piece, as authorities combed through the documents Elizabeth and Ashworth had provided. But while the victory was sweet, it came at a great cost. Elizabeth had lost everything she had once known. Her innocence, her life at St. Margaret's, her very sense of self, these had all been stripped away by the Academy. And yet in the end she had found something far more valuable, the truth, the power to control her own destiny. Ashworth, too, found his own redemption. He had brought down a dark empire, but in doing so, he had paid a price. Ashworth, too, found his own redemption. He had brought down a dark empire, but in doing so, he had paid a price. The system he had worked within for so long had been complicit in the suffering of countless innocents, but now he had seen it for what it truly was. Together, they had uncovered a nightmare hidden in plain sight, but that nightmare, once exposed, was no longer a secret. The world was awake. As the trial progressed, and St. Margaret's Academy crumbled into the ashes of its own lies, the once imposing figure of Mother Superior Victoria Whitman was brought to trial. Her facade of holiness, of piety, cracked beneath the weight of her crimes. Every detail of the Academy's operations came to light. The manipulation, the trafficking, the broken spirits of the girls who had been robbed of their futures. But Whitman's trial wasn't the only one to grab attention. The revelation of the vast network of wealthy men, politicians, and influential figures who had conspired with the Academy sent shockwaves through New England's elite. Those who had once lived in their ivory towers, untouched by the suffering they had caused, were now dragged into the public eye. The walls that had shielded them from the consequences of their actions began to crumble, one by one. Elizabeth stood in the courtroom, watching as the women who had once held her captive faced the consequences of their actions. She knew that nothing would bring back the years she had lost, the years that had been stolen from her and from the other girls like her. But seeing Whitman's cold, calculated face as she was led away in handcuffs gave Elizabeth something she hadn't had in a long time: justice. But justice was not a simple, clear-cut thing. Elizabeth understood that now. The world she had once believed in, where good people were rewarded and bad people were punished, was not that simple. Some battles were fought in the dark, hidden behind closed doors, where the powerful played games with human lives. And yet, Elizabeth had survived. She had found her voice, and in doing so, she had become part of something bigger than herself. She had exposed the darkness that had held so many in its grip. But the fight for justice was far from over. The aftermath of the trial left the city of Salem in shock. What had been whispered about for so long, what had been hidden in plain sight, was now undeniable. The echoes of St. Margaret's Academy would reverberate through the town for generations. The orphan girls who had been forgotten, those whose lives had been consumed by the Academy's twisted agenda, were no longer nameless victims. They were survivors. Elizabeth knew her journey wasn't over. She had become a symbol, not just for herself, but for all the others who had been silenced. Her name was now tied to a movement, to the fight against systemic manipulation and psychological control. But with the spotlight on her, the danger didn't disappear. The powerful men who had once turned a blind eye to the Academy's operations were not so easily defeated. The darkness that had festered beneath the surface of St. Margaret's would find new ways to survive, new ways to thrive in the shadows. And as Elizabeth walked away from the courthouse, she felt the weight of that knowledge. There was more work to be done. Ashworth, too, had found himself irrevocably changed. The truth he had uncovered had torn apart his view of the world. He had been a part of the system that allowed such corruption to flourish, and now he had to reconcile the role he had played in enabling the suffering of innocent children. But he, too, had found redemption. In exposing the truth, he had taken the first step toward understanding the depths of his own complicity. Together, Elizabeth and Ashworth formed an unlikely alliance, one born from a shared desire to protect the vulnerable, to expose the systems that preyed on the innocent, and to ensure that such horrors could never happen again. But the journey wasn't over. Elizabeth's story spread like wildfire, catching the attention of people far beyond the borders of Salem. Those who had heard whispers of St. Margaret's now saw the full truth. It was a chilling reminder that darkness could fester in the most unexpected of places. Institutions that were supposed to protect the vulnerable could, in reality, be the ones who trapped them. The revelations also sparked a wave of investigations across the country. Authorities in other states began to look more closely at orphanages, schools, and institutions that had been hiding their own dark secrets. The fight for accountability had only just begun. As Elizabeth traveled from town to town, speaking out about her experiences, she encountered other survivors, other girls who had once been trapped in similar systems of control. Some were too broken to speak, their trauma too deep to confront. But many had found their own voices, their own courage to stand up to the institutions that had failed them. Together, they formed a network of survivors, a collective that would fight to expose the hidden abuse in orphanages, schools, and religious institutions across the country. Elizabeth's story, once confined to the walls of St. Margaret's Academy, had now become a symbol of resistance, a rallying cry for those who had been silenced for too long. She knew the fight wasn't over. There was still much to be done. The system that had allowed such horrors to exist was vast, its tendrils reaching into every corner of society. But Elizabeth was no longer afraid. She was no longer just a victim. She was a force of change, and she would not rest until every last secret was exposed, every last victim was heard. Months passed since the trial, but the battle for justice never truly ended. The girls who had been trapped within the walls of St. Margaret's Academy were free, but the scars of their experiences would remain with them forever. Some chose to start anew, to rebuild their lives, while others struggled with the trauma that had shaped them. For Elizabeth, there was no easy escape. Every day was a reminder of the price she had paid for the truth. But she had also found something in her pain, something that was now a driving force in her life, the need to protect others. She had seen what could happen when a system of control was allowed to operate unchecked, when those in power were allowed to abuse their influence without fear of consequence. As she looked out over the city of Salem, she realized that the real work had only just begun. The fight for justice wasn't something that could be won with one trial, one victory. It was a long, grueling battle, one that would require the commitment of every survivor, every voice that had been silenced, and every person who believed in the power of truth. The corrupt systems, the people who had profited from the suffering of others, would not go down quietly. But Elizabeth was no longer afraid. She was part of something bigger than herself now. She had uncovered a world of darkness, and she had become the light that would expose it. In the years that followed, Elizabeth continued her advocacy, speaking at rallies, in front of government officials and at schools, determined to ensure that what happened at St. Margaret's Academy would never be forgotten. She had become a symbol of resilience, a living testament to the power of truth. But as she traveled, speaking to the masses about the dangers of unchecked power, she could never fully escape the haunting memories of what had transpired. The faces of the orphan girls, their eyes hollow with fear, their voices silenced by the system, would always be with her. She had fought for them, but now she fought for all the others who had suffered in silence, whose stories had never been told. The fight, she knew, would never truly be over, but she had ignited a spark, a movement that would continue to burn long after she was gone.